Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning. And we're going to be talking about e-invoicing mandates and how they might affect you in the year coming up, and also obviously into the future as well. So we're going to be talking about some of the challenges that you might face in implementing them, how to overcome some of those challenges, and just talk about how your supply chain and your processing might be affected in the process, and how to overcome some of those challenges, as I said. So this morning we're really pleased to be joined by Ruud van Hilten from from Tungsten Network, which is now part of the COFAX. So really pleased to be joined by him. He's a well-known expert on the topic, so we're going to be chatting to him in just a second. So you do have the opportunity to ask questions all throughout the webinar. If you look onto the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see there's a chat function in there. So if you've got any questions throughout the webinar, just pop those in, and we can answer those questions for you at the end. So just perhaps now, if Ruud, if you could just introduce yourself for anybody who obviously doesn't know you already, and then before we just get started, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ellen, and good day to all. Good morning to most of you, I guess. I'm Ruud van Hilten indeed. I work for Tungsten Network, now a COFAX company, as Ellen already said. I head up compliance, specifically product compliance in Tungsten Network. My job is to ensure that what we produce in terms of legal invoices for our customers are indeed compliant, and that we remain compliant in the countries where we are. That means that we need to keep a very close eye out on developments in the market, specifically around the invoicing mandates. I've been in the market for about 17 years, had several jobs or positions inside Tungsten Network, ranging from commercial to marketing to now compliance. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about my favorite topic, which is e-invoicing mandates.
Thanks very much, Ruud. And for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Ellen Leith, and I'm the Managing Director of PPN. And PPN's a community, a network community for anybody working across finance, procure to pay, and procurement. And the purpose of that is really to provide everybody with a platform where they can find out the latest news and information and insights about cultural practices within our businesses, supply chain changes, and also, of course, technology and automation and digitization. And of course, within that, a part of that is e-invoicing, and it's becoming a more prevalent part of our working lives. So, and as many of you know, part of that is e-invoicing mandates. So, Ruud, it seems like there's not a week really that goes by before we don't hear about another country implementing mandates. And do you think there's a particular reason why it's happening now, that we're hearing so much about it?
Yeah. The answer here is yes, Ellen. So it's not completely new. So the idea of what's called an e-invoicing mandate, where literally the government stipulates that the invoice format in a country needs to be electronic. And let me be clear about what electronic is. Electronic is not a PDF. Electronic is very often a structured file, like an XML or a JSON file, that the government then stipulates to be the tax artifact. It's been going on since around about 2011, mainly in Latin America, then moved over to Europe, but also to parts of Asia. We'll talk about that later. Why is it happening? Why is it happening now? I think most of it is driven by VAT gaps. As you can see also on the slide, every country has issues with collecting sufficient VAT. Sufficient not in the sense that to make to provide them with the national income that they need, but rather sufficient in terms of the expectation of the collection in a country. So there's always a key performance indicator in any country that literally indicates the amount of tax, amount of VAT, I should say, a country is seeking to collect in a year. and typically countries are falling short. At the same time, what you see is that these VAT gaps are under pressure from all sorts of macroeconomic circumstances. So the issue with if you have a big VAT gap is that A, it can run out of control fairly quickly. We'll get to speak about that, but also B, it all affects your credit rating, and it will absolutely also affect your ability to borrow money. There's a sense of urgency, I think, amongst most governments that they need to do something, and they need to do something now. And I would say, why is it happening now? Is because A, it's been proven. We can see from Latin America, but also from other countries like Italy, that this actually works quite well. If you look at the objectives that countries have, and at the same time, I should say that the technology is there; it's available. For a long time, this technology was sort of out of reach for governments, but today it's there. It's readily available, and I would say that the business case is a complete no-brainer because you're talking about additional collection of tax of several billions of euros a year, and the investment into a government platform will also probably take 1 or 2 billion. But of course, you recuperate that money incredibly quickly. So I think it's happening now for a reason. There's a sense of urgency, but also the possibility presents itself to do it.
Yeah. The capability is there, perhaps, as you're saying, in a way that it maybe hadn't been in other years in the past. So you mentioned just briefly there about Italy, and of course they are some way down that journey already, and we've got France coming up in 2024. Do, do you think that the drivers are the same? You've mentioned there about the tax gap, but do you think that the drivers are the same in all the different countries that we see implementing the e-invoicing mandates, or is there perhaps a different reason for some people, some more
I think
countries?
Alan, that's actually a great question. I think generally speaking, the drivers are pretty much the same. The VAT gap, well, let me put it differently. These matters are typically packaged up slightly differently. Hardly any government will come to its business community to say, you've created a tax gap, let's do something about it. It's much more about tax simplification, making things quicker, more transparent, more visible, and all
Mm,
these things apply in all countries. Everybody's after a tax reform that makes things more simple and also makes things more transparent and visible. But the background is always fighting fraud.
mm,
A VAT gap doesn't arise. You don't run short of money because everybody's paying the taxes. It's because people are not paying their taxes. And the best way to do something about it is to move your model from a post-audit model into a pre-audit model. So instead of waiting after the transactions, and sometimes, as we all know, several years after the transaction before you get audited,
mm,
the transaction gets pre-audited, which of course gives the government much more certainty that they will be collecting the tax. But at the same time, you can use these as instruments for flexibilizing the tax system, making it more visible and transparent. So I think
mm.
overall the drivers are pretty much the same. And we should realize that VAT is roughly about 30% of the income of any country. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. Hmm.
At the same time, also, VAT is the most versatile instrument. Income tax isn't really. You can't just, I would say, I'm going to use a rather informal term, but you can't play around with income tax that easily.
Mm,
Frankly, you'll have a revolt on your hands if you do. But VAT is a much more versatile instrument, and it will allow you to recuperate costs that you create elsewhere by
mm,
simply taxing more heavily on things that people own or use, which also seems like a fairly fair system. But
mm.
apparently, people pay what they are supposed to pay, and which is why most governments come after the money. So I would argue the drivers are generally the same, even though the focus may be on any one of those particular objectives. There's
Mm,
one other thing I need to say. We always talk about indirect taxation as in VAT, value added tax, or GST in some countries, or consumption tax, or whatever the name for it is. But actually today it's gone beyond that. And that's something that we need to bear in mind. It's not just about the VAT gap, it's not just about VAT. What we are also now seeing is indirect tax around environment, sustainability and governance,
mm,
ESG taxation, like for instance, carbon tax, plastic packaging tax. and such, which are now agreed in Europe and will also be implemented across the European environment. So it's not just going to be about VAT, it's going to be quite a bit wider and in that sense quite a bit more disruptive. But at the end of the day, it's always about transparency, making things more flexible, visible, and making sure you collect the tax.
Yeah. So lots of, I suppose, lots of different drivers, but one overall goal in the end was simplicity and visibility being, I guess, at the top of that. Do you think it makes much difference with the countries which direction they're going in? Say if you're looking at narrowing that tax gap, or if you're looking at it more of a controls stance, do you think it makes much difference to how you go about it?
Oh, that one's difficult to answer, but I will try anyway. So I think the short answer is yes. Some countries decide to impose controls, which we also call mandates, continuous transaction controls, CTCs. A number of countries actually go about it in a different manner. They don't really want to burden the business community with an e-invoicing mandate and actually go for more stringent reporting requirements. Like in the UK, we've seen Making Tax Digital for tax, VAT, as one of these regimes where you move from a fairly or completely analog environment into a much more digitized environment where you need to report income and VAT much more quickly, but also much more transparently. In other countries, you see regimes like SAFT, a standard audit file for tax, which is a very, I would say, almost very intrusive OECD standard reporting mechanism that you need to use in countries like Poland, but also in the Netherlands, for instance, and some other countries where you don't necessarily see any appetite for any invoicing mandate. But I also see countries where we have these stringent reporting regimes, like Spain with SII, or Hungary with real-time invoice reporting, or SAFT in Poland, for instance, where still a movement is made into electronic invoicing as a mandate, because it still gives the thing with reporting is always retrospective. No matter how real time you make things, the transaction has already happened.
It's already happened, yeah.
So what governments are trying to do is to actually get ahead of the transaction and to make sure that the tax is visible before the transaction actually really happens. Of course, movements of goods will have already happened, or services will have already been delivered, but it's about the financial transaction itself, and that's exactly what governments are trying to move into. I think
And I suppose you have more control if you're doing it up front like that. Then you have more control overall, don't you?
Much more control. Yes.
Okay. So, do you foresee any bumps ahead on this road? I mean, it sounds a relatively complex environment. What bumps do you see ahead for
I
us?
see many bumps. My life is all about bumps, Helen. It's about understanding the bumps as they happen. So you just mentioned France as an example of a country that will follow Italy, but we know, for instance, in Europe, we'll also see Poland, Spain, Denmark, Slovakia, and other countries follow, Belgium, more or less, I would say, announcing similar constructs in the country. Also, Japan, Malaysia, Australia are also moving in this way. So I think we're looking at a global movement. At the same time, no mandate is the same. That's a big bump. They're all implemented in a different manner. So the objectives are the same, but how they are implemented may be very different between two countries, even if they are two EU member states. The chosen model, centralized, decentralized, including reporting, including cross-border invoices or not, is very different between these countries, which makes it incredibly hard for businesses to comply, especially if you do business in more than one country. You'll see more of this. We also see governments being pretty ruthless about it. As you see on the slide, the mega trends are there. We are in crises on a number of different areas. There's a war, we have an energy crisis, we've got cost of living crisis, but then multiple healthcare crises as well. Still dealing with the aftermath of COVID. We are dealing with aging populations in some countries, which will put a bigger demand on healthcare, thus requiring more money. All these things together force governments to do things and do things quickly. And everything they do quickly, in fact, is a little bit of a bump in the road.
Mm.
The other thing I would say is that what we can't ignore is that Europe at some point will be stepping in. So if we specifically talk about the European community or the European Union, Europe is about to step in. Actually, they're probably about to step in today. And I literally mean the 8th of September with VAT in the digital age, which I think we're all waiting for to see what shape that
Mm.
is taking and what Europe is prepared to step into. So I think the biggest bump is variability. It's all different, and it requires a lot of adaptability on the side of business communities in countries to try and comply with all the different regulations.
Yes, I mean, I'm just thinking if I was a CFO in a large enterprise size organization with many cross-border mandates to deal with, that's surely going to give me a bit of a headache, isn't it?
Yes, well, it depends on how you look upon it.
Mm.
It's a bit of a headache because it's not probably not what you were planning to do as a business, right?
Mm.
You're not in the business of trying to comply with what the government wants. You're in the business to deliver goods or services that deliver you profit and shareholder value.
Mm.
Uh, at the same time, it is an opportunity. It's not just a threat. I would immediately agree. It is a bit of a nuisance. These things happen
Mhm.
when you don't need them, but they happen. So it is an opportunity in the sense that you can use these mandates to accelerate your digitization agenda.
Yep. Mhm.
You can seek to work with your supply chain, inbound and outbound, to create better visibility, to create better invoice data. But make no mistake, a PDF is not an electronic invoice. And
Mm.
you may have also invested in EDI, which is probably also not going to survive these mandates. So it takes some thinking, it takes some reframing of the issue into an opportunity. But the opportunity is really there.
I guess, Ruud, that while you're there, I mean, I think that for anybody who's listening, maybe it's worth explaining why you think PDF is not an e-invoice, because there could be somebody thinking, well, actually, why is it not? You
That's
know
a
what?
good one. I always assume people think, oh yeah, no, you're right. PDF is not an invoice, but that's a very good pointer. Yeah, a PDF is not an e-invoice because it's not a structured file. It's not data as such, and typically governments would not consider a PDF an electronic invoice, but it is a digitized invoice if you wish. It's a
Mm.
representation. It's an image. And of course, you can use all sorts of technologies to get the data off the PDF. You can use some metadata, and you can do scanning and OCR capture, which Kofax knows all about. But in the end of the day, for processing these invoices in central government databases, PDFs aren't going to be very
No.
helpful. And think of it yourself as a company. You receive PDFs. What do you do with those? You can't just import them into your ERP. You need to do something with them. You either need to read the data from the PDF or you need to digitize the data from the PDF,
Hmm. Hmm.
which basically means it's not really an electronic invoice.
Okay, so you talked about the bumps in the road and that you like the bumps in the road, and I guess part of the bumps are part of the job is making those bumps less bumpy and more flat.
Yeah.
And also about the PDFs, and the PDFs aren't an e-invoice, so you need to perhaps look at your digitization that you have at the moment. So, bearing all that in mind, and the e-invoicing mandates that organizations and countries may have coming up, what can organizations do right now?
I'm going to use a very commonplace phrase, prepare. I think the worst
Hmm.
thing you can do is go reactive and wait for it to happen. I know it's
Yes.
tempting because it's something that you weren't planning to do. It's something that was maybe not in your business planning or budgets, but
Mm.
waiting for it to happen basically will mean you're too late. You'll be stuck with what the government imposes, and that's going to be it, and that's difficult.
Mm. Mhm.
Preparation means that if you look at this proactively, um, you know which countries you do business in, and you know which countries you are likely to be subject to any one of these mandates.
Mm.
And if you know what that means, then you can also understand your exposure in the near future, but also in the longer run. Um, I would definitely say don't try to do it at home. Try to find a partner in the market that is represented in the markets that matter to you and can help you with connecting to these governments rather than you trying to do it yourself. What you are really
Mm.
looking for is what I would call a universal adapter. something that sits in the middle that can deal with all the flexibility and variability. Whereas you got single input into that adapter, single output from that adapter. If you
Mm.
get yourself to that position, you're probably in a great place to take advantage of what's happening. If you wait for it to happen and to be sprung upon you, you'll be too late, and I can guarantee you'll be in a perpetual state of panic. Um,
Yes.
and what you will also find is that governments don't stop after the implementation of their mandate. They keep making changes. So either you
Mm-hmm.
get yourself ready for it, or be prepared to be in a perpetual state of panic, I would say.
Which nobody wants to be in, because of there are external pressures apart from this we're
Exactly.
talking
Yeah.
about today, for sure, anyway. So simplify what you can and control what you can, I think, is
Yeah, and
key.
there's one other thing I would say and I can't actually stress that point enough. It is an opportunity if you look at
Mhm.
it wisely. So look at it how
Yes.
you can accelerate your supply chain and making and accelerate your digitization agenda in the organization, because you can.
Oh, exactly. There's lots of other benefits which come out of it, even if it is something which you have to do out of necessity.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a reason for that being a necessity as well, that you might want to be a part of yourself anyway. Um, So, where do you think we're headed? Do you think we're heading towards a place, an environment where all countries will eventually be subject to e-invoicing mandates? And
Uh,
what about UK, for example, as well?
that's a good question. The all countries perhaps a bit stark, because there are still some countries out there, or quite a number of countries, that actually don't have VAT, or this notion of value added tax on goods and services.
Mm,
Countries that do and that are surrounded by other countries that have already gone this way probably will see no other option than to do it too, because at the end of the day, this is also about your competitive position as a country. And it is simply a fact that if you are better at collecting tax, your competitive position is better because you have more money. You can do
mm.
more. So I see that this is probably going to be a model of the future. Not just, I wouldn't say that everybody will go down the path of electronic invoicing as an obligation, but definitely e-reporting, um, creating visibility to the tax authorities earlier than they do today, and making things easier. Because making things easy is also part of let's say, the attractiveness that you
Mm,
have as a country for businesses to actually be a taxpayer in your country. So so there's a lot that countries are prepared to do to be an attractive environment for companies.
mm,
Um, about the UK, um, you've already gone down the path of making tax digital for business, which I think is no different from what the reporting regimes I've seen in other countries. Of course, the manifestation, the way it works, is not the same as we've seen in other countries. But as I said before, no system that we are seeing there is akin to another. But they all come
mm,
from the same drivers. I don't really see an appetite in the UK to move to electronic invoicing, to mandatory electronic invoicing yet. That may change, but not today. And
mm,
there's an indicator for that. And there's the level to which business to government business to government transactions are already electronic. And in the UK, that is still primarily focused on the NHS, and not necessarily as a mandate into, let's say, into other sectors of the public sector.
mm,
So, judging from that, I'd say that the appetite is still relatively low. Making tax digital for business is young. It's only been implemented, roughly about a year ago, and the
mm,
outcome of that is still to be seen. The only point I'd make is that typically, when you look at the objectives of a government and the time they give themselves to realize these objectives, that reporting regimes take longer to achieve these objectives than e-invoicing mandates do. Uh,
mm.
Housing mandate is pretty much instantaneous. Can't say if UK will go that way, but you can already see there are controls and there is scrutiny in the UK, like there is in any other country.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose you mentioned a little bit just then about tax and back in digital age. We're having to maintain our the controls anyway, not to maintain, but to implement those controls to some extent anyway,
indeed.
aren't we? In terms of making tax digital and VAT in the digital age. I mean, what can you share? You mentioned something about the updates that we're potentially going to see today. I mean, can
Yeah,
you talk about that a little bit more, perhaps?
yeah, with a
Um,
bit of a caveat that I don't know exactly what Europe is going to do, but we have some ideas that we've obviously been hearing about and have been discussing.
mm,
Um, they probably will affect the ones we know for pretty sure. Is that, things that will affect is first of all the platform economy, specifically services delivered in countries like transportation, accommodation. So very clearly anything to do with rooms and taxi type services from platforms in countries
mm,
will very likely be taxed in the country where the services are delivered, which is a major change for these organizations and will probably change their business model. Another change we think we'll see is European VAT registration. So
mm,
today, as a business, you can be registered in multiple EU member states under a VAT. Well, you don't need to be a taxpayer in the country. You can still have a VAT registration, and there's good reasons to do that, to be liable for VAT in these countries. Um, that's that's a cumbersome, painful process to get VAT registration in other countries. Europe has absolutely been contemplating having Central European registration for VAT, meaning that you have a VAT number for the European single market and not necessarily for every country separately, which is also a draconic change, I would say. And the last one, probably most relevant for this discussion, is that he intends to ensure that cross-border transactions, so invoices that you send as let's say a Dutch supplier to a buyer in Germany, or an invoice you received in Holland from a German supplier. Those are cross-border transactions. These need to be reported into a central European database in a certain format. And the underlying assumption there is that these invoices will be electronic. Now,
mm.
whether that will be a mandate or not remains to be seen, but it's fairly implicit that it will be an electronic invoice. And that's got far stretching consequences,
Mm.
because it may mean that in a country where there's no e-invoicing mandate, there is still the obligation to report your cross-border transactions electronically. And I think the underlying hope is that when a country gets into that situation, they'll end up doing national e-invoicing anyway, because they're trying to create a consistent environment for businesses.
Mm.
So that's what we're expecting to see in the course of today, or maybe in the course of the next few days. But I have to be honest, Ellen, I need to study the text to see exactly what it says and where Europe is going. But it's clear that Europe is stepping in.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for sharing that with us, Ruud. It's something obviously that we all need to be aware of. Whether, and as you say, interesting to hear how it's going to affect countries, even if they haven't got e-invoicing mandate in place anyway. So you've talked about what to me sounds like a fairly complex environment, although as you say that there are opportunities to be gained from from going down this route anyway in terms of visibility and the controls and efficiencies that you can find by going down this route. Um, but we mentioned briefly at the beginning about Italy and what they've achieved. They seem to have overcome a lot of the challenges and have implemented it well. Is it something that or a model that other countries could follow? Do you think? And if they
They
and if they haven't already, perhaps why haven't they?
They are following already, Ellen. Um, yeah, Italy was very successful, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but Italy wasn't known for its fiscal discipline before the introduction of that mandate in 2019. I think it took everybody a bit by surprise, in the sense that we were probably not expecting Italy to do this.
Mm,
But they did after a good number of years of successful business to government invoicing from 2000, roughly 14 onwards. They moved into 2019 with an e-invoicing mandate, which was absolutely blanket. So every taxpayer in Italy was subject to it straight away, the business taxpayer. You see other countries go phased approach, where they
mm,
start targeting specific groups of taxpayers initially,
mhm,
which has the disadvantage of having to maintain two processes for quite a while. Italy just went big bang. And they have been very successful. For those of you who may not know, in Italy, it's impossible to just send your invoice to the buyer. It needs to be sent to a government platform called Sistema di Interscambio, which is Italian for exchange system. Needs to be sent in a structured file as an XML. And the Italian government will make that a legal invoice, and then they send it to the buyer. So it's no longer the supplier sending the invoice to the buyer, it's the Italian government that does that. That's a centralized model. It's also the type of model that drives sort of like the largest change in the country for businesses, but it's probably also at the same time the model that is easiest to implement for a government and easiest to maintain. So Italy has been extremely successful. They've been able to reduce their VAT gap with roughly about 10–11% over the past few years. And you're talking billions of euros.
Mm.
And in July 22, they added the cross-border element to it, saying that invoices to and from Italian buyers to foreign and from foreign entities must now be reported to the same Sistema di Scambio in the same format as a domestic invoice, which means that the government now has full visibility of all invoices, domestic and cross-border. And that, frankly, is the best way to uncover fraud, because much of the fraud is usually done through cross-border transactions. But of course, for businesses, this was enormous. And I can say from experience, because we are working in Italy, we've been working in Italy since 2019, but we're compliant much earlier, is we've seen a huge increase in numbers of transactions through our e-invoicing network, of course, because of all the cross-border transactions. But what we've also seen is that for companies that were working with a partner, so using what we call an intermediary, a company in between the platforms and themselves, were much better off and were live much more quickly than those who try to do it at home, if you want to put it that way. Simply because, and this is something that we all need to realize, Italy is on our product roadmap 3 times a year. So 3 times a year, we see a relatively major change in Italy happening. This goes back to the point I made earlier. Once a mandate is in place, the government will continue to tweak it.
Yes.
So that's also why I make the point is don't try to do it yourself, because you'll end up in perpetual change mode. You're much better off having us doing that for you. But overall, I would say Italy was very successful. Other countries are following Italy's model, and sometimes their example. France is doing exactly what Italy wants to do, or wanted to do, but will use a completely different model. Whereas Poland, for instance, will use exactly the same model as Italy. So the freedom of choice is still there, the objectives are still the same, and Italy has been a lighthouse for everybody, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting what you say about using a third party or an intermediary as well. I think that's one of the things that we often talk about here at PPN, is because it's as well to do that where you can, because you've got the experience. If you're just trying to do it yourself, you can only think about it from your own perspective. Where if you work from a third party, you've seen all the different challenges that there can be, and found the solutions to those challenges, and have the experience of that as well. So it just makes sense, as well as it being an absolute headache really to try and do it yourself. And as you're saying, permanently in a change mode, which means you can't really get the results that you are hoping for.
Exactly right.
Yeah. You said that a lot of countries go in phases, and they tend to start with B2G transactions. So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about that, and all the different countries that are implementing e-invoicing mandates. That must mean there's an awful lot of data going between those transactions into those governments. So it'd just be interesting to know what are they doing with all the data that they're collecting.
It's a great question, because we haven't spoken about data yet, and one of the reasons why governments are doing this is all about data. Right, Ellen, governments gather enormous amounts of data, and very important data for them. If you just imagine that how much easier it's going to be to target fiscal response to challenges, to see if you understand how businesses, how your own economy works, where your major taxpayers are, how taxes are paid. But also, you get an enormous amount of insight into payment terms and all sorts of other things that will help you target fiscal response. You move away from trying to target an entire country, right, and you move into being able to target fiscal response to very specific industries or sectors of an economy. Again, there's the fraud element as well. The
Mm,
more data you have, the better you're going to be capable of uncovering patterns that are or may point you to fraudulent behavior. It gives you insight into cryptocurrency movements, high volume transactions or high value transactions that require further scrutiny. It also helps for governments, back to the objective of making things more simple, more simpler and quicker, to pre-populate tax returns, to actually at some point come to a point where tax returns are simply no longer necessary, but are just done automatically by the government. So that data serves a good number of different objectives. And again, if you look at why this is so important for governments, is that public spending in any country is roughly, depending on which country you are, is between 30 to 55, 60% of GDP, the gross domestic product.
mm.
Typically, enormous amounts of money are involved here. So you have to get that under control. Public spending is the easiest to literally let get out of hand, and that again affects your ability to be competitive. It
Mm.
affects your ability to respond to challenges or disaster or crises. And so you must have that under control. And of course, you do want to have the data so that you can target your response properly, as I said here, detect risk for fraud, and also ensure that you can allow your taxpayers to self-service themselves without necessarily having an army of people dealing with tax returns.
It's interesting you talked about fraud and being able to have the visibility on those cross-border transactions to be able to maybe see what's going on there better and to control that and to obviously to prevent that. Um, do, do you think that there is just your opinion? Do you think there is more fraudulent activity going on now than there has been before? I mean, is that part of the reason why countries are going down the route of e-invoicing mandates to try and prevent a more prevalent threat environment as far as fraud goes, or is it just a consequence of being able to do it?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure there's more
Put
fraud.
you on the spot.
Yeah, you did, but a very good one. I'm not so sure there's more fraud. I think there is. It, it feels that there is more because we uncover more.
Mm,
Um, the But there is another element to this, is that fraud isn't just about avoiding tax. Fraud is also about laundering to
mm,
fund activity that we'd rather not see, like terrorism or other criminal activity.
mm.
And imperative that the government gets a good control over that. So I'm not sure there's more. I think we uncover more of it, but also I think that financial crime, if you wish, or tax crime has become a lot more sophisticated. And that's
Mm.
also why governments need much more sophisticated models to try and deal with it.
Okay, all right, and I suppose yes, it has the once you've got the visibility and controls in place, you're able to do something more about it and perhaps prevent it. We talked about being able to do things up front rather than after the fact, and I guess that gives you the opportunity perhaps to be able to do that. Um, but what about our own environments? There probably are plenty of people on the webinar today who have elements of automation already in place, whether that's e-invoicing or perhaps there are people here with the PDFs that we've already talked about and sending those through. What can organizations do now to get ready for what may be coming ahead? Looking at perhaps their ERP systems, what might need to be updated there, and maybe the controls. Because one of the things that interests me as well is that with Italy, you talked about having the big bang approach, and it worked for them. But perhaps there was a lot of work that went on ahead of that they were prepared for it. They knew it was coming and they prepared. So when that big ban came in, they were able to get the objectives that they wanted out of it more quickly. So organizations listening today, what can they do to prepare, bearing
Yeah,
in mind their own environments?
yeah, it's a good thing you refer back to Italy, because when Italy happened, it was the first in Europe, and of course, I think in a way caught many of us by surprise. And
Mm,
I'm sure that for a while people actually thought this was never going to happen, but it did. Um, so first of all, as I said, make sure the countries you do business in, are you going to be in scope of a mandate in the foreseeable future? Foreseeable future, I say, is that you need to have a window into the next 18 to 24 months. Most governments announce their plans quite early on.
mm,
You roughly should have access to, let's say, technical specifications round about, let's say, a year before the actual implementation date. You need to be prepared for the fact that governments delay, uh,
mm,
uh, because they do, and they do make last minute changes, but these are hardly ever fundamental. Um, I would say, as I said before, don't wait for it to happen, but you know it's
yeah.
going to happen anyway. Prepare for it today. There's a number of things you can do. First of all, I would say start formulating a proactive approach for the countries or the country you're going to be affected by, and understand what is going to be required in the country, and understand how you want to go to market with this. Is this something you want to do through a third party because you find it too distracting, too much of a
Mm,
nuisance, too much change? And that probably may depend on in how many countries you already do business, and how many countries you're going to be facing these changes in. If it's in one country, you're probably in better shape than, for instance, when it's in 10. But you still need to brace yourself for that ongoing change. I've heard too many stories from companies who said, we tried to do this ourselves. The government made a connection available to their central platform directly to businesses. But we found out that we ended up in almost like perpetual change mode, like we said before. So can you absorb that, yes or no? Then a very practical advice is that you need to start understanding where is your data in your ERP. Do a data audit. Specifically, once you got the requirements from a country, which fields need to be reported, which fields do need to be in the invoice, which fields are optional, which fields are mandatory, is something that you need to have very, very clear and understand where is that data. And I'm saying that specifically because one trend we're seeing, and Poland is a very good example of that, is that countries start combining or converging, if you wish, what we call periodic controls with transactional controls. So an invoice is a transactional control, but SAFT, for instance, or making tax decisions for business is a periodic control. And they require different data. What we're now seeing in Poland is that the Polish invoice from January 2024 will require elements of periodic controls,
mhm,
things you would normally not put into your invoice. So where is that data? Of course, you have it because you're reporting periodically, but how do you make that available on a transactional basis to an invoice is something that you really need to spend some time on and you need help with.
mhm,
So I would say a data analysis based on requirements in countries, and I think the best place to start if you do business in Poland is probably with Poland, is to start looking at, what is that requirement? Where is that data? That's very important. Um, I say the third thing I'd say is set up a plan for yourself with regards to what am I going to do to take advantage of this? Is there a way for me to use this in procure to pay to get better invoice data? Because there's one thing you need to remember is that what the government considers important in an invoice is not what you, as the owner of a procure to pay process, find important. Your objectives are completely different. So the government will want tax data, but you want purchase order information. You want to be able to match the invoice. You want to make sure you can pay on time and the
mm,
invoice passes through passes straight through. The government doesn't care about straight through processing. They care about tax collection. So what are you going to do and how are you going to be working with your supply chain to make sure that you get rich invoice data? Taking advantage of the fact that everything will be electronic anyway, what can you do to work with your supply chain to get better data? And it's very
mm,
often also where e-invoicing providers can help you. So I think the point there is to do not wait with adopting true electronic invoicing before there is until there's a mandate, but try to do it
Mm,
before. Because I know for a
absolutely.
fact that those of you here that already have e-invoicing are probably going to be in better shape.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. To be prepared and to be ready for it, I think
Yeah,
is a good idea, and to make sure that your data is in a fit state um, when it comes to it as well. Like you're saying, to make sure you know where those elements are and whether that data is going to be clean enough to be able to do what you need to do as it becomes necessary. So, I mean, the intention for the e-invoicing mandates has been, I guess we talked about earlier, to make things more simplistic, easy, and efficient. Do you think we're achieving that?
depends on who you ask. If you ask governments, they'll probably say yes. If you ask businesses, I'm not so sure the answer is yes. Depends on what the businesses have done. So for those businesses that are actually taking the bull by the horns
Mm,
and actually went proactive, I think they would argue that things did become more simplistic. They become more flexible, faster, more transparent.
mm,
The feedback from the Italian business community is definitely not bad. People say that actually, once you get used to it, you're used to it. So, I would say in a way it takes time, but it does serve the purpose and
mm.
it does meet the objectives. But if you are late to it and you're not prepared for all those changes, you're not really paying that attention, then I would say that it doesn't drive any efficiencies for you as a business. So
Mm.
that's why if you wanted to be driving efficiencies, effectiveness, then you need to prepare for it.
I guess like anything, and I think we talk about that in terms of moving towards a digitization anyway within people's organizations, is to make sure that they really know what they're trying to achieve as well, and to be not to be forced kicking and screaming into that new environment, but to
I agree.
take control of it yourself, and to look at the objectives you as your organization want to get out of it. So I think that preparation that you're talking about there, Ruud, is going to be absolutely key for people. Just before we close and go to a couple of questions, I think got any tips that you would say to people? Obviously, Ruud, you've been involved in the industry for a number of years and have seen all the successes that there have been in Italy and in other countries as well. Is there any tips that you would share to people who maybe are just about to embark on this journey?
I'll end up sounding like a broken record, Ellen. At the end of the day, it's not rocket science. Yeah, a couple of things you know is going to happen. Hope is a really bad strategy here.
Mm,
Don't hope it's going to go away because it won't. There's too much money involved. We're talking about billions of euros or pounds or dollars. This is not going to go away. There is a way to prepare for it. I would also say if you do business in multiple countries, don't take one country at a time, but look at a sort of larger umbrella strategy. How are you going to be approaching this? Because at the end of the day, all these mandates are pretty much the same, if you wish, in the sense that they will want to see an invoice before it's being sent to the buyer in a structured format. You know that.
mm,
We probably won't see anything dramatically different over the next few years. We'll see a lot more tax reform down the line in, around about 2030. But until then, this is going to be our reality. Um, I would also say review your ERP. Many ERPs, especially the large vendors, will build connectors into government platforms. That can be both a blessing but also a hindrance. Once you go down that path, you end up having to change whatever the changes the government makes. But the data question remains. Where's your data? Understand what's going to be required by the government in a country. And
mm,
can you get that data readily available, yes or no? You also, if you're a receiver of invoices, you're probably also a sender of invoices. So you need to start looking at these things almost like holistically. I understand that most of you here are on the P2P side, but your company also has an order to cash cycle. And at the end of the day, it's all about the same types of invoices. You just need to, it's almost like the pyramid upside down. You
mm.
now need to not receive them, but you need to send them. And that's equally difficult. So And when I say look for the data, I'm specifically looking for the order to cash bit. But if I say, also look at how you process invoices on the P2P bit, but you are going to be receiving a completely different invoice
Mm,
that will look in no way, shape, or form, similar to what it did before. How are you going to be dealing with that? What's your process going to be? You need to make yourself aware of what's going to happen if you don't agree with an invoice, because you can't, in some countries, you can't just reject an invoice anymore. There's a process for that. So there's a lots of things that you need to bear in mind. And I would say, my final comment will be work with a specialist,
mm.
work with a company like a third party that has done this before, has gone through the pain in Italy or some other countries, know what it takes to do it this way, and can actually show you how they will insulate you from trouble, basically.
Excellent. Some good tips there, Ruud. Thank you for sharing those with us. No, that was great. So we do have a couple of questions, and the first one of which I think I can probably guess what your answer is going to be, Ruud, to some extent. But somebody's asking about what about North America and Canada?
Yeah, interesting question. I would say that both are, so today, specifically the United States, I would say are, on the risk of sounding flippant, but it's a bit of the Wild West of invoicing. I mean, anything in the US qualifies as an invoice. If you call it an invoice, it's an invoice. But of course, that causes all sorts of issues after the invoice. We know how incredibly complex sales tax is in the US. US are absolutely on their way to, through the Business Payments Coalition, are absolutely on their way to looking at creating standard, American standards, so that businesses will have to conform to standards at some point. That's not going to happen overnight, but the country is already piloting, or will start piloting in spring next year. We'll start piloting an exchange system
Mm,
where invoices are being shared in structured format. So this is, it's actually a great question. This is going to affect any place in the world, even where there was almost complete liberty before.
mm-hmm,
And we can almost count on if US goes, Canada will go too. And Canada is already having discussions internally, and I know with specialists about, what are the available models, what can we do? Because Canada's system, of course, is a lot more complex with GST, HST, and all sorts of other tax types that they have, look quite a bit more like Europe, and may very well move the same way. But I know there are discussions ongoing, and things are actually getting quite advanced in the US.
mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's something which is happening globally, really, isn't it? That's the
Yeah.
way. And I guess if you're looking at it in terms of making things more simple, and those opportunities that you talked about as well, so it's and a way to for governments to collect money enough from their tax, and in doing so prevent fraud. I suppose those drivers are going to be the same throughout the world. It's just the way that we go about them to get there in the end. Um, another question for you, Rud. Where you implement XML or CXML, do you have to have a copy of the PDF invoice too for audit purposes?
Great question. Yes. Well, I would say not legally, because at the end of the day, no, I need to qualify that answer again. Depends on where
Mm,
you are. So in some countries there is a regulated PDF required, even though the legal invoice is an XML or a CXML or a JSON. There is still a human readable required that complies with certain regulations in a country. Mexico is a really good example. But it also serves to have a PDF copy, also from audit purposes and workflow purposes. People are not very good at reading XML. So if you need to use workflow, because for instance, the invoice wasn't under a PO, or there's something wrong with the invoice, you need somebody to have a look. It's much better to have them have a look at a PDF rendering. But also in audits, a PDF is very often your first line of defense. Many tax authorities and tax auditors would like to see a human readable before they actually go into the XML, and it will actually help your audit if you do have a PDF copy. So the answer is, in some countries you actually must have one, like for instance in Mexico and some other countries. In other countries, it would just serve purposes, not necessarily legally or fiscally, but would make audits easier or would help your workflow.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Ruud. Finally, I know we are over time, so let me just finally, if you would, and as briefly as you can, Ruud, as well. How about Sweden?
I would say Sweden is having discussions about going to electronic invoicing. They've had a business to government mandate for many years. In the foreseeable future, I can see Sweden moving exactly the same way and go for a B2B mandate. A very good indicator, something to watch, is which countries ask the EU for permission to go electronic invoicing. Every country that wants to impose electronic invoicing on its taxpayers must have permission from the EU. That's called a derogation. That derogation, once a country asks for it, you know that in the next 2-3 years, they'll actually go that way. Sweden hasn't done that yet, but Germany just has, just so that everybody knows. But that's a very good indicator of which countries are going to come next.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Ruud, and thanks for all of your questions. If anybody's got any further questions, I know we've got some just coming in, then please do put them forward to me at ellen.leith@p2pnetwork.org, and I'm sure we can get ask Ruud to answer those over email. I'm sure he'd be
I'd be delighted.
Okay, well, as I say, thanks everybody for joining us on what is actually our last webinar of the year, and we look forward to welcoming everybody back onto our masterclasses and webinars into 2023. But at the moment, thanks very much, Ruud, for sharing your invaluable insights into e-invoicing mandates, and I hope you will have a fantastic day. Thanks again to you, Ruud.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alan.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.